Hi, boys and girls. In this episode, we look at comparing and contrasting stories. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to recall the elements of a story, compare and contrast story elements using graphic organizers, use the appropriate terms to compare and contrast elements in a story. So here we have stories. Once upon a time, this is how many of them begin. A description of the people or events, whether they are written or spoken. In stories, they can be real life accounts or made up or imaginary. They can have any setting or character. It is all up to the storyteller's satisfaction. Some have similar elements such as theme, conflict, and plot. Most are quite relatable, whether they are alike or not. And comparing and contrasting them, the stories, helps us to appreciate them more. They are the key that bring you to many worlds through figurative doors. All right. So, do you have a favorite story? Have you ever read a story that had similarities with your favorite story? Or have you read two stories that are alike in some way? While some stories are unlike any other, there are many stories that have similar story elements. So, what is a story? A story is a written or spoken description of people or events that are real or imaginary. Stories are most often told for entertainment. Now, what are story elements? Story elements are the basic parts that make up a story. Story elements include character, setting, plot, conflict, solution, and theme. Many stories have similar story elements. In this lesson, we will learn how to compare and contrast story elements. Explore, let's dig now. Before you compare and contrast stories, let us see if you remember what each story element refers to. Solve the riddle below to correctly identify the story element being described. Riddle me this, riddle me that. Guess me this riddle or perhaps not. Number 1. Sometimes the story ends with my absence, leaving the reader in great suspense. What am I? So this would be the solution. Okay. I tell when and where the characters are. That could be the setting. 3. I can be a thing, animal, or human. I am the one who talks and performs all the action. What element am I? So, the character. Sometimes more than one person is involved. I have two names and I need to be solved. What am I? The problem. 5. I am very important. Throughout the story, clues can be found. For I am the one the message is centered around. What element am I? Possibly could be the theme, but we'll learn more. Explain. Stories have similar or different elements. When you highlight the similarities, you are comparing them. When you highlight the differences, you are contrasting them. Comparing and contrasting story elements help the reader to develop a deeper understanding of the two stories. This further aids in building your general comprehension skills. When comparing, we identify the things that are alike. Therefore, when we compare story elements, we say how the element in one story is like the element in another. For example, many fairy tales have similar elements. Many of them have similar characters such as princes, princesses, kings, queens, evil stepmothers, etc. They also have similar settings such as kingdoms, castles, villages, or forests. The theme in fairy tales are also very much alike. They often talk about understanding the importance of love and caring for each other and teaches us not to be unkind or greedy. Even though several of these stories can be compared by highlighting things they have in common, The contrasts can also be seen. For example, though Cinderella and Snow White both had stepmothers who did not care for them much, Snow White's stepmother tried to kill her, while Cinderella's stepmother only forced her to be a maid. Snow White was forced to run away to save her life, while Cinderella's life was not in any grave danger. When comparing and contrasting stories, you can use graphic organizers such as Venn diagrams to show the similarities and differences between the stories. You can also write paragraphs or essays to explain the similarities and differences much better. When comparing, you may use terms such as like, alike, in common, similar to, just as, same as, just like, or both. When showing contrast, you may use terms such as although, different, in contrast to, however, while, unlike, on the other hand, not the same, the difference between, or even though. So those are some signal words. Using these terms will help the reader to see clearly what comparison or contrast is being made between the stories. Let's go a little further. Read the two stories below, then complete the story element graphic organizer by filling in the relevant sections. Story 1, Fox and Bear. Fox saw the field being planted with corn. He went to visit Bear and suggested that they share the field. Fox said he would have the tops of the corn, and Bear would have the root. When the crop was grown, Bear did not like having only the root of the corn plants, but it's what they agreed. The next year, Fox saw the field being planted with turnips. He went to visit Bear. He said that, to be fair, this year Bear would have the tops of the crop, and Fox would have the roots. While the crops were grown, Bear was unhappy again. He had only the bitter tops, while Fox had the nice sweet turnips. But it was what they had agreed. However, Bear never agreed to share the field with Fox again. The Camel and the Pig. Camel said being tall was best, and Pig said being short was best. Camel said if he was wrong, he would give up his hump. Pig said if he was wrong, he would give up his curly tail. They came to a garden inside a low wall. Camel reached his long neck over the wall and ate his fill. Pig could not even see over the wall. Then they came to a garden inside a high wall with a covered gate. Pig went through the gate and ate his fill. Camel was too tall to go through the gate. They thought about all this and declared that Camel would keep his hump and Pig would keep his curly tail because, as Pig said, tall is good when tall is needed. Of short, the same is true. So, what do these stories have in common? So, here's our activity. Complete the graphic organizer to show the comparison and the contrast between the stories read. So, contrast here for story 1, contrast for story 2, and what they have in common. It says here, activity 2, write a paragraph highlighting the similarities and differences between the elements of the two stories. So, in this episode, we're looking at comparing and contrasting stories. You should now be able to recall the elements of a story. You should be able to compare and contrast story elements using a graphic organizer and use the appropriate terms to compare and contrast story elements, some of those signal words. So, that organizer that we saw at the end, please complete and post here. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.